Well, I guess it's a good time to start then, huh? Let's see. Let me hit record here. Okay, so hi everyone. Hope you're all doing well out there. Welcome to another Getaway Live author event, which is part of Soho Crime's Getaway series, where we introduce mystery readers just like yourself to a new mystery or thriller series in a newsletter that goes out every Tuesday from now through August. So before I pass it over to our wonderful authors, I just want to let you know that even if you are muted, you are in no way silenced. Please feel free to use the chat function to type out any questions you may have, or if you have any conversation topics that you'd like to hear more about. My colleague and I, Alexa, will be monitoring the chat and filtering the questions to Juliet, our wonderful moderator. So without further ado, Juliet.
Hi, everybody. I am the lucky gal who gets to edit at Soho Crime both James Sallis and Stuart Neville, and I'm overjoyed to be talking to them today. They've never been in the same room together. They are two of the most thoughtful, philosophical gentlemen I've had the pleasure of meeting in my life, and they write such gorgeous character-driven crime fiction that is so multi-textured and genre-defiant, and I'm just so happy to have this chance. You know, they've already introduced themselves to each other, but for any of you who might be familiar with one and not the other, this is just a junket. I'm just so excited. So let me try to be very organized and give them the introduction that is their due. But I'm going to start with James Sallis, who this here is Sarah Jane, which is this gorgeous volume of his republished last fall. It's coming out shortly in paperback. We are also the lucky publishers, republishers of his backlist series featuring Lew Griffin, a New Orleans private investigator. You know, I've had the pleasure over the last couple years working with Jim on Sarah Jane and on restoring the Lew Griffin novels, but his career is so rich and storied. I mean, he's really a living legend, not just of crime fiction, but he's what we call a writer's writer. He's someone that writers across all genres will tell you have influenced their work. He has been a participator in so many facets of the literary community, both as a critic and commentator, as an educator, as a poet, a translator, and of course as a writer. And everything that he does just has so much grace and energy and philosophy behind it. I think that you'll find a slender little volume like Sarah Jane really just packs so much into it. You may know his other slender little volume, Drive, which was the inspiration for the Ryan Gosling movie. So I mean, really, this guy, it's just such a pleasure and honor to be working with him at Soho. Our relationship is relatively new, just maybe 3 years or so, but it's really just been so wonderful for all of us at Soho, and we're so happy to have him here today. To tell you about Stuart, my relationship with Stuart at Soho is not new. In fact, you could say that Stuart Neville is the reason that I'm at Soho right now. I knew Stuart Neville before I came to work at Soho, which is now, Stuart, it's been 10 years. Can you believe it? It's 10 years. We were friends when Stuart's debut novel, The Ghosts of Belfast, was published by Soho Press. And so when Soho was looking for a crime fiction editor, Stuart wrote a recommendation to my now boss, Bronwyn, and brought me on board. And now he's been paying for it ever since because he has had to work with me editorially. But the reason I wanted to be friends with Stuart in the first place, I'm sorry, Stuart, it was in fact a very opportunistic friendship on my part, was because he was such a fantastic writer. I remember reading first just the synopsis of the book that became The Ghosts of Belfast when Stuart was at that point still just becoming a writer, or rather admitting to the world that he was a writer, I should say. And I was so taken with it. I was like, this guy, he's the real thing. He's amazing. And now 10 years into his writing career, Stuart is one of the writers I most often see other modern writers comped to when I'm doing sales presentations. And I just, I think that that's a sign of how, of the effect that he's had on the crime fiction world in the last 10 years. But so The Ghosts of Belfast, which was published by Soho in 2009, right? Is his debut novel, is a story about an ex-IRA hitman in Northern Ireland who has been released from prison and who is being haunted by the sins of his past. It's one of the great crime novels of the 21st century. You should definitely read it. But we've had the pleasure of working with Stuart on 9 books now, including this one, which is coming out this fall, The Traveler, which is a short story collection and is fantastic. Both of these gents who I've just introduced have been either nominated or recipients of just about every literary prize in the world. I can't even list them. We'd be here the entire hour, and I don't want to hear myself talk anymore. So if it's okay with you, I would like each of you to give the kind people in the audience a real bio of yourself, where you tell them all the things that I missed. Jim, you go first.
Okay, I noticed you didn't use the word brilliant. I thought we had understood that that was to be inserted often. But other than that, thanks a lot, Juliet. Well, you know, as with most writers, I think I was doing it from, you know, from the cradle. It seems I was always telling stories. I'm from the South. It's a storytelling culture, and I've brought that forward. And by the time I was in elementary school, I was writing plays and I was writing stories, and this just continued. By the time I was in college, which was about age 17 or 18, I started writing fairly seriously. And I started publishing poetry and science fiction at the same time, and the science fiction made a little bit more money than the poetry, so I tended to concentrate on that. And I managed to sell 3 stories almost immediately. One to Damon Knight for $300, and this was in the early 60s, so that was an awful lot of money. One to New Worlds in London, which would change my life. And I just decided that if I could write this story and get $300, I was set up for life. I've thought that several times as a writer. It's been wrong every time, but I still think it every time I place a poem or every time I write a story. After publishing a few stories, I was asked to come to London to help edit New Worlds, which was an avant-garde science fiction magazine. Published Brian Aldiss, Jimmy Ballard's early work, a lot of very, very important work. I knew nothing about editing, but then I didn't know anything about writing either, and that hadn't stopped me. While I was there, several things happened. One of the most important things was Mike Moorcock, who was the publisher editor of New Worlds, introduced me to Hammett and Chandler. Somehow, even with a literary education and being a constant reader, I had never run across these American writers. And I was completely entranced and taken by the picture they gave of the society in which I grew up. The other thing was, as a sort of literary editor for the magazine, I started seeing a lot of translated literature that I never would have seen in the States, especially French. And I became quite taken with writers like Boris Vian, Raymond Queneau, and Philip Jacotet, and many others. And these 2 things, the influence of science fiction and the influence of this continental literature, became extremely important to me. I was still writing poetry, and I think to this day, the poetry is extremely important to what I do. I don't see that the work has changed much through the years. I would still be a short story writer if it were left to me, but since there are so few places to publish short stories these days, I don't write as many as I used to. Though since Sarah Jane, I took some time and have written several, probably a dozen or more, and they're beginning to show up in literary magazines and Ellery Queen's, Alfred Hitchcock's Asimov's, and so on. I enjoy it, but I really do need to be working on a novel and am doing so, but I never know what it is, how much it's going to weigh when I put it on the scales, and if it's just going to flop around like a fish, or if it's actually going to move around and do something.
I was going to ask you that, Jim, because you have you have some very slender novels. Is there a line for you between what is a short story and what's a novel?
My students contend that I still write short stories. I just publish them as novels. But, I am so driven by the idea of poetry and how much you can get into a sentence or a phrase. And when I'm teaching, I tell my students over and over, you want to strive to get as much of the world in every phrase and every sentence and every paragraph as you can. Often people speak of my work as being minimalist, but I don't think it is. I think that idea of compression, of being as economical and as accurate as you can be, is really what drives it. Uh, a a book like Sarah Jane, or a book like Others of My Kind, uh, they have the substance of a novel 2 or 3 times their length, but it's all pushed down, and it's all spoken of as quietly and as urgently as it can be. And that's sort of the path I've taken in moving forward. And I, you know, I go back again and again to that idea that I'm from the American South, which is a storytelling culture. You would be sitting out on the porch and you would be hearing about, Jimmy Sue and what he did last weekend, and about how no good Johnny was. And my grandfather had memorized many old poems, and I've written how I would sit in my house and I would hear him coming up the hill to the house reciting Hiawatha or Snowbound, or one of these long, long narrative poems that he had memorized as a child. I think all of that just feeds into everything I do.
Do you miss the South?
Boy, that is a complex question.
Yeah.
I think all Southerners are very conflicted about that whole thing. Uh, do I miss the South? I miss the sense of community that I had growing up. And for years, I had wanted to write about small towns, and I couldn't find a way to do it. And it wasn't until the Turner books that I really found the vehicle for it. And now I seem to be sort of fixated on that, because I did the Turner books, and Sarah Jane's about 2 different kinds of small towns. One of them sort of in somewhere on the West Coast, and the others are sort of scattered around the South. But there are certainly many things about the South I don't like. And as a dyed-in-the-wool progressive, growing up in a small town across from horrible, horrible shacks where Blacks lived in poverty, and where all of the power and all of the capital in the city was under the control of 3 people, leaves a mark. It radicalized me from the age of 14 or 15.
Yeah, that is, okay, one final question before I ask Stuart the same. So the fine people who are attending today, they have encountered your work through Soho Press, so that say they're already familiar with Sarah Jane and the Lew Griffin series. What other books of yours would you recommend that they might enjoy? Tell us about that rich oeuvre that Soho didn't get to publish.
One of my favorites is Others of My Kind, which was the first time that I wrote from a female point of view, which Sarah Jane's written from a female point of view. Nervously, I should say, wrote from a female point of view. It's a very odd, near future kind of book, but there's just something about the weight of it, and the character and the voice that I really, really love. The most complex book, I think, is The Killer is Dying. And it's one that I remember the time I was writing it, I kept telling my students I have absolutely no idea in the world what this is, which has sort of become a slogan for everything I'm writing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim. So Stuart, now we're up to you. Tell us about how you became a writer.
Yeah, well, I think like Jim, it was something that was with me from a very early age. I mean, I when I was 6 or 7 years old, I had this idea of being a writer. And I did try to write. When I was a kid, I would get like little jotters and start writing stories, which I'm sure were brilliant at the time. For I don't think stand up now, 40 odd years later, but yeah, and it that stuck with me until I discovered music. And as a teenage boy with certain hormones rushing through me, music seemed the more appealing path at that point. So that kind of took me on a detour that lasted into my 30s of convincing myself I was going to be a rock star. There came a point where I realized, actually, no, that's probably not going to happen at this point. And also realization that if I wanted to write, I wasn't getting younger, and if I'm going to do it, I have to take it seriously and do it now, which is probably about, I'd say, 15 years ago, maybe. And that's when I started seriously trying to write. I wrote something like 3 novels, one after the other, and a bunch of short stories. And the third of those novels was The Ghost of Belfast, which started as a short story. But Jim talking there about his background in the South and so on, writing about small towns. I was very adamant when I was starting to write that I was not going to write about Northern Ireland. I was not going to write about the Troubles. That was just something I didn't want to touch. And then the idea for The Ghost of Belfast presented itself, and there was no getting away from it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the book that I didn't want to write became the one that got a publishing deal. So yeah, I think sometimes as writers we have to get past our own barriers that we set for ourselves. Sometimes subjects we don't necessarily want to touch, we sometimes have to confront them whether we want to or not. And yeah, it just went on from there.
Can you tell us a little more about how and where you grew up?
Yeah, I'm from a town called Armagh in Northern Ireland, about an hour outside of Belfast. I still live quite close there now. And I was born in 1972 within a few days of an event called Bloody Sunday, which was a mass killing in Derry. And it's one of those seminal events in the history of Northern Ireland that sort of shaped the next 30 years. And yeah, all through my childhood into adulthood, I lived this sort of backdrop of I guess you could call it a low-level civil war that went on for all that time. And again, because of something that was too close to my own experience, it wasn't something I actually wanted to write about or talk about. But I think that's the sort of thing that you can't escape it. It's there, whether you want it or not. But like most people in Northern Ireland, I managed to stay out of trouble. I mean, for most of us growing up through that conflict, we didn't actually have first-hand experiences. We weren't fighting ourselves. We weren't, it was something that was happening 2 streets over, kind of thing. So I was fortunate that I never lost anybody very close to me. I lost some cousins and kids in school. One kid in my class in school, his father was shot in front of him. That kind of, so it was also almost perfect. Sometimes a bomb would go off and we'd have to hide under our desks at school, that kind of thing. But it was just a thing that was there. It was normality. Didn't strike me at the time that soldiers on the streets pointing rifles at me was something particularly unusual, or that there were certain parts of town you could not go to because you were the wrong religion, that kind of thing. That was just normality, and it's I think to my children now, and even my nephews and nieces who are a bit older, who came along after the ceasefires, that would seem like a really alien thing to them. But for me at the time, it was just how we lived. Sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say are you, in terms of being a writer, are you an autodidact? Where did you, when you were in your late 30s and you did decide to turn to writing, what were your guidebooks?
Well, in terms of just why that happened at the time, I think it was just one of those kind of moments in life where you meet a crossroads, where you have to stop and think, what am I going to do now? And writing was the path I still hadn't explored seriously, and that was the path I chose then. But in terms of influences or what I want to write, I mean, again, I actually started off trying to write horror, oddly. I mean, I grew up, I was an 80s kid. And if you grew up reading the 80s, you read Stephen King. It's just the law. And so I was usually influenced by that and some of the maybe lesser known UK horror writers. But that kind of morphed into crime fiction as I got older and into my 20s, and I started reading James Ellroy and Dennis Lehane and that sort of later kind of noir movement. And I found when I sat down to write, even if I started trying to write horror, it always kind of turned into crime somehow. It just naturally drifted that way. And I think all writers are a product of the reading. So whatever you read in your kind of formative years, that's what's going to come out when you sit down to write. But that's why my stuff has always had that kind of thread of it's crime, it's thriller, but it's always had that thread of something other within it. You know, the woo-woo, as some people would call it, you have the slightly supernatural thing, which, you know, I find a lot of readers like. Some don't, but a lot do. And again, like, just like I can't escape where I grew up as a writer, I can't escape those influences either. And if I sit down and try to write pure crime, some horror will wind up. And if I try to write horror, crime's going to wind up in it. It's just I can't separate the two.
Yeah, but that's beautiful. I mean, I think that's something the two of you have in common is we're publishing both of you in Soho Crime, but the genres we could talk about either of your books in are multitude. And I love that richness and complexity. I'm both an apologist for the crime fiction genre, but also a person who thinks genre should be thrown out the window, and unless it's helping people specifically find things they like. And I would like each of you to, if you can, tell us what you're working on now.
Jim?
I never know from one day to the other. You know, as I said, I spent a great deal of time. Usually when I finish a novel, I write short stories for my own purge or clearing my palate or whatever you would want to call it. So I got those done, but I'm still hitting on those. Those are still coming back to me. I'm working on two things which are longer, and I'm not sure which is going to claim precedent and which is going to maybe become a long short story or get filed away somewhere on a hard drive. One is a novel set in New Orleans, which I've not done for a while, a possible novel. And the other is yet again set from a female point of view, which for some strange reason I find very comfortable, about a nurse who sort of becomes a detective of sorts when a friend disappears, and whose mother was an actress in horror movies. She was a scream queen. And everything that Hannah, the nurse, sees sort of reminds her of one of her mother's movies. And that's a lot of fun. So that's what I'm doing.
I can't wait.
I'm in the process of tearing apart a novel that was finished, and I decided it's not finished. So I'm deconstructing it and putting it back together again. And I said, Juliet has been incredibly patient waiting for this novel for a very, very long time. I promise it's nearly there. It's nearly there. It started off, I don't know if you have this problem, Jim, sometimes. I know I do. Very often when you start to write something, it takes a while to figure out what it actually is. And there have been things that I started writing that I thought maybe would have been a novel, but that turned out to be a short story and vice versa.
Yes.
And this book, it's told in two different timelines, one in the early 60s and one in the present day, but the two stories dovetail. And the book was finished and edited, well, partly edited to me and my agent and so on. And then I looked at it and realized, no, the present day story, I've stripped it out and I'm writing an entirely new present day story to dovetail with this early 60s set story, simply because the present day story wasn't what I wanted it to be. and I wanted something stronger. And it happens sometimes. You write something and you scrap it. I've written, in the last couple of years, I've written an entire novel that has been tucked away, will never see the light of day, and stories and maybe 10,000 words or something. And there's times you maybe have to take a couple of swings at something before you figure out what you've got, or you write something and you set it aside and come back to it a couple of years later. A book of mine called Those We Left Behind, I started writing something like 2012, then put it away and then came back to it like 3 years later. And it happens sometimes. Sometimes it takes you a while to figure out exactly what you've got and what you want to do with it and what you want it to be. So I find that's my biggest challenge as a writer these days. It's just when I start something, figuring out what exactly it is.
Well, I think, Stuart, that's the fun of it. It's also the slog of it. Yeah. But when you feel there's something there that you can't pick out and hold up in your hands and look at, but it's there. I years ago decided that for me, it was like sensing there was something in the corner of the room, and I'm trying to figure out what that is. And as I write, I begin to hear it breathing, and I hear a sort of rustle as it moves about and sort of scrapes up against the wall. And the more I write, the more visible that thing becomes. It becomes a light shadow, a dark shadow, and then begins to take form. And I'm just writing towards that, and I don't know where it's going. And as a musician, I'm always thinking how much this is like music, in that I'm working from this sort of structure, this sort of skeleton, which is the head, it's the changes, the melody. But I'm going further and further to see what can I do, staying within this, but pushing it and trying to connect with these things that are sort of floating up from the subconscious. And I think that's what you learn as you go on and as you write more and more and more, if they'll let you.
Who's this they, huh?
Well, any of us these days are lucky to have editors and publishers who will stick by us. This is a very difficult time. I started writing, which was a long, long time ago. We probably need a moment of silence for that. If you wrote a novel, you were fairly assured of having that published and then the next one published. And by 3 or 4, you had a career. These days, I have friends who have written 12 novels, 40 novels, who can't be published. It's just everything has changed so much, and none of us really understand publishing at all. So I think that those of us who find the editors and the publishers who will give us the support and understand what we're trying to do, those of us who can get the help from booksellers and bookstores who can see and understand what we're doing and hand sell the books in many cases, and then those wonderful, wonderful readers who are out there and stay with us. We're truly blessed to have those things.
Yeah, I think the point about booksellers is so important, and they are
yes.
right now because of not being able to be open, but just cultural points that bookstores become, where people encounter and discover and stay with authors. It's so important on our end too. Actually, Jim, as long as I have you on the line, there are a couple audience questions about these early career moments I'd like to ask you now. But first of all, how did you come to be published by Gary Lew Griffin? Did you submit the manuscript or were you commissioned?
As I said, I discovered Hammett and Chandler, and I started reading that, and then I read Ross MacDonald, and I was just reading through, learning all about this. I read a lot of Ed McBain, I read Nero Wolfe, it just kept going. I finally found Chester Himes, and I was fascinated by Chester Himes, which is no surprise to anyone who knows that I wrote a biography about him. But it was a world that I couldn't imagine. I was finding the same delights in Himes and the same surprises in Himes that I found in crime fiction as a whole. It was talking about the society I actually saw around me and not the society I was told about and taught about in school. So learning that Himes had been a, quote, literary writer who then began writing genre novels. I was thinking, who is this person? I started looking back, finding out what I could about him, and getting more and more interested in him, reading the autobiographies, reading all the novels. I just one day decided that I was writing science fiction. I was going to write a mystery story. So I wrote a mystery story, which was the first of the 4 parts of The Long-Legged Fly. And I thought it was just a short story. Uh, it was a short story. And then I thought, this guy's pretty damned interesting. I think I'd like to sit down and have another cup of coffee with him. So I wrote the next part, and then I realized, something is happening here. I'm writing about 2 periods in this man's life. Let's look at the third period. And by the time I wrote the third one, I realized that this is kind of a novel. So I wrote it. I started submitting it, and as I remind my students over and over, I think it was probably turned down 36 times, if I remember. I looked up the submission record at one point, and then was finally accepted, and seems to have done well since.
Amazing. Well, it's just publishing is not, I don't want to talk about it. I've been working in publishing for 15 years and I don't know how it works. So I find these stories very inspiring. Actually, I had planned to ask both of you, and you've both mentioned the power of music in your lives anyway, but Stuart's got this whole wall of guitars behind him. Look at this, it's beautiful. But you're both musicians. Another thing that you have in common, maybe that's the brain connection that makes you both so poetic and thoughtful. I don't know. Can you tell us a little bit about your musical lives? Stuart, you get to go first, but also Doug in the audience has a great piggyback question we're going to tack in here. Which musicians, past or present, would you most like to jam with? So, Stuart, music in your life.
Well, it just so happens that Doug is the drummer in my band. Question come up. Doug is one of my fellow fun-loving crime writers, an excellent crime writer as well. He just published a book called The Big Chill in the UK. I'm not sure it was coming out in the States. But yeah, I'm in a band called the Fun-Loving Crime Writers with Val McDermott, Mark Billingham, Chris Brookmeyer, Luca Bessa, and Doug. And we all write crime, and all the songs we play are about crime. We do I Fought the Law, we do Watching the Detectives, we do Hey Joe, any song that's vaguely crime related, we'll play. But yeah, something's been with me since teenager, possibly even further back. My father was a country singer, and yeah, I've been a musician as long as I can remember. I'm unhealthily obsessed with guitars, as you can see. As for who I'd like to jam with, apart from Doug, obviously, it's hard to know because all the musicians I admire most, I'd be terrified to actually play with. I think, I could say it would be good to say jam with Miles Davis, but I couldn't keep up. I wouldn't be able to do it. I have certain heroes, as some people might recognize the stripy pattern guitar. I'm a Van Halen fan. Classic rock blues end of things is kind of my bag. I've been fortunate to meet, I don't know if you can see this, you won't be able to make it out, there's a picture just above my head there of me meeting Jeff Beck. And I can tell I was much more excited about it than Jeff Beck was. I have to be honest. He'd be one of my heroes as well. But again, I don't know, I wouldn't be fit to stand on the same stage as Jeff Beck. So I couldn't see jamming with him. John Bonham, I'd love to play with John, would have loved to have played with John Bonham, great Led Zeppelin drummer. So yeah, that was a very long answer to a simple question. Sorry.
It's not simple. It is, you point out the nuance. It's difficult. Jim has a room much like your room, equally full of instruments, I understand.
Yes, unfortunately. Karen claims that I have 40 guitars, but I think she's including mandolins and banjos and Hawaiian guitars in that. But there are, she's saying, I have not in there. She's counteracting what I'm saying, but you know, the music started about the same time as the writing and publication did, and I think you know, there, I loved science fiction, and I loved detective fiction later, mysteries, because for me it was always about people on the edge. It was about marginal people. It was about people with huge decisions to make. But at the same time, unlike much of the quote literary fiction that I was reading and that I was studying in school, it was a literature, these were novels, these were short stories that had dirt beneath their fingernails, and they always kept that. And that was the same thing that I was attracted to when I listened to folk music of all sorts, which was very big in the 60s when I was coming around. And for me, though I didn't intellectualize it at the time, I realized that there was a straightaway there from the literature and the music, that I was interested in those edge things. I was interested in those marginalized people. I was interested in something that had folk origins, that people were involved, and it was sweaty. It was a little dirty all the time. It was a little messy, like our lives. As far as influences, you know, a lot of old stuff from the 30s and 40s. Blind Willie McTell is one of my favorites that I listen to again and again. Western swing, I absolutely love, for the guitar playing, for the fiddling. And, you know, Stuart and I were talking earlier about what we do. One of our sets can have something like, you know, Faded Love jammed right up against an old song from the 30s with two banjos, one of them fretless, and a musical saw. So we do a lot of old stuff like that, and those are the things that I keep coming back to again and again.
Speaking of, as long as we're talking about some criminal songs, Stuart, Jeff suggests Psycho by Leon Payne, recorded by Jack Kidd and Elvis Costello, which is a country serial killer song. So,
We play that song.
oh, well, there you go. All set.
As part of our set, we play that, and it's one of our highlights of our set.
Amazing. Well, I hope that eventually I get to see the two of you jam together. Gentle audience members, I tried to con them into jamming together today, but it was roundly agreed by more intelligent people that the delay on the Zoom would make that impossible. So,
and we're both so shy too, which is a huge problem. Yes,
it's true. Okay, I have oh man, the audience questions are coming in. This is great. Before I turn over to audience questions entirely, I do want to talk about, I know that you both have a personal relationship with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that this is important to you and something that we've been talking about. I was wondering, here as publishing personnel, we have made an effort to try to buoy works by African American writers during this moment to help people black out the bestseller list and really draw attention to African American writers. Does either of you have any books that you would like to recommend to the people in the audience who are looking to engage in that initiative with us?
Yeah, I've picked out three that I like. I mean, an author that I really like, Attica Locke, who I met about 10 years ago at the LA Times Festival of Books. And she's a lovely person as well, just a really funny, warm person. But she's a book called Cutting Season, which I particularly liked from a couple of years ago. She writes TV and stuff as well, but what I like about her work is that it's politically charged, it's very political, but it doesn't sacrifice the crime novel. You know, it's a crime novel that's very political, and neither element is kind of overshadowed by the other. So you can come at it and just read it as a crime novel. You can come at it and read it as a Cutting Season in particular is kind of, it reaches back to slavery and so on. You can come at it both ways and get lots of different things out of it. A British writer called Mike Gale. I don't know how well he's known in the States, but he writes, I'm just going to go through different genres here. Mike Gale, he writes guess what I used to call male confessional novels. So, like Nick Hornby, that kind of genre. I hate this phrase chicklet, but it's the male equivalent of that. But very funny, very human, very warm stories. And a recommendation from my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter.
Perfect.
Yeah, which is Rachel Renee Russell, The Dork Diaries. So anybody has little kids in that sort of middle grade reading range, The Dork Diaries are one of my little girls is obsessed with them. Like she's counting the days till there's a new book coming in October, and she's absolutely dying about that. So those are my recommendations.
Excuse me.
About children's books, but it's because I don't read them myself, but there's important recommendations. I really appreciate that.
Again, it's not going to be any great surprise that I'm going to talk about Chester Himes for a moment. The entire Harlem cycle, but especially Blind Men with a Pistol, which does they all accomplish, but especially Blind Men, that delicate balance that Stuart was just talking about, where yes, it's a crime novel, but yes, it's also a very political novel, which is something that for some reason in the States, we have a lot of trouble achieving. It seems to happen a lot more in European literature, Scandinavian, British, French. But even more important to me in the discussion we're talking about is a novel of Chester's that's not well known at all, which is Run Man Run. It's out of sequence. It's the only thriller straight ahead that he ever wrote. And it's about a totally innocent black man being chased through the entire novel by a psychopathic cop. And it is a stunning, stunning book that no one ever talks about. And it is so germane to what we're talking about that, I want everyone to go out and try to find it right now. In fact, and we've got a few more minutes, and then I expect you all to be online trying to order a copy. And good luck with that.
You know what we should do, gents? We should circ to all of the people who are watching the list of titles afterwards so that they can have the go-to, and they can go to their favorite local independent bookseller and order them. Or, So Stephen, you'll be able to help with that afterward, right? Cool.
Great idea.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, let me turn to some audience questions because we have 15 minutes left for that. Okay, Stuart, we're going to start with you.
Hey.
In the audience, Gina Marie has asked if there's any possibility in future books that you will be leaning back into the supernatural. She loves all your recent books, but she's just wondering if there's a chance.
Well, funny you should say that. It is kind of going. It's strange. It's kind of a cyclical thing because my first 2 books in particular were there's a very strong vein of the supernatural through them. I always wrote it in such a way that you could approach it as being psychological rather than supernatural. And it always amused me when I do a reading somewhere. And even though in Ghosts of Belfast, it's always played with the idea whether they're actual real ghosts or whether they're just figments, manifestations of the protagonist's guilt. And even though the book comes down on one side of it in a very definite way right at the end, I find readers, if they have decided one way or the other, whether it's psychological or supernatural, you will not budge them. Even though the book actually tells them what it is right at the end, they will not be shifted from the opinion they've formed. And I think when I first started publishing, I started realizing the reader brings a huge amount to the book. Their own beliefs, their own sort of baggage, whatever, their own experience of the world really shapes the way that they experience the book. And that was a real surprise to me when I first started being read by other people. But yeah, I had that kind of supernatural element really in the first couple of books, and I consciously moved away from that as the books went on. But the short stories that I wrote always kept a little bit of that. And I found myself being over the last, particularly the book that I'm working on at the minute and the short story collection that's coming from Soho, I've been drifting back towards that. So yeah, the next couple of books, I think you'll see a lot more of that side of things, and I still like to play with the idea of whether things are actual supernatural in the world or whether they're manifestations of a person's own issues playing out around them, whatever. So they'll always be a little bit ambiguous in that regard. And I'd say the next couple of books they're going to be in that direction. It may drift back again. I don't know. As you know, I'm easily bored.
Forces you to be entertaining for us, so that works out. But so Jim and Gina Marie would like to know, how about for you? Is there any possibility of a sci-fi mystery hybrid?
Well, one of the interesting things, Juliet, which I certainly did not plan, is that these science fictional / fantasy / psychological things have started showing up in what I write, even though I'm writing crime novels. And I think this first happened in probably Death Will Have Your Eyes, which was a spy novel. And strange, surreal things are going on there that really are never explained. And then it emerged again in The Killer Is Dying, where a 15-year-old who is living on his wits after being abandoned by everybody is having the dreams of a killer, of a hitman. And it's never really explained why it happens. And I just found that fascinating. It's one of those things, much like what Stuart was talking earlier, this stuff keeps pushing itself into your conscious because it's part of what is underneath. It's that stuff that's roiling under the surface all the time. And it just feels right. This is the stuff we're groping towards. And this goes on, and the science fictional element certainly is in all the short stories, many of which have been or will be published or have been in science fiction and fantasy magazines. But even in Will Not, which is a Southern novel, if it's anything, there's a science fictional element in that the protagonist is a doctor, a physician in a small town. His father was a hack science fiction writer. So I have a lot of sort of in-jokes about science fiction, a lot of stuff about science fiction mixed in with it. So in that sense, it comes in. In the future, I don't, as Stuart and I have both said, who knows? These things push up from below, but they also sort of fall upon us from above like a piano. So we'll see.
I do wonder. Sorry, Julia. I might be overthinking this. It might be a pretentious idea, but I wonder how much of the kind of turmoil of the last few years that in America, for a whole different set of reasons, over where I live because of Brexit and that kind of thing, and a lot of the ground isn't quite as steady under our feet as it was maybe 5-10 years ago. And I wonder how much of that is sort of manifesting in writing that stories that aren't necessarily as literal as they were. I don't know if that's prompting maybe a shift, because I don't know, just speculating.
I'm sorry, Juliet.
No, I was just gonna say,
that's a great question. I used to wonder, it seemed every 6 or 8 years, a lot of movies started showing up that were about how wonderful everything was after you died. And I thought, there's a reason for this. And yeah, I think as things become less and less certain and we don't know what to hold on to, we do start coming up with these things. But another huge if you look at what's happening in the science fiction market, the fantasy market, and in the States, we're seeing an awful lot of stories about pandemics. We're seeing an awful lot of apocalypse stories. And I don't think that's only publishing. I think that's just what is in our minds all the time. We can't, we're under siege, and we have a siege mentality that we can push away the thoughts for a while, but they always come back. Yes, we have to go on eating, we have to wash up after ourselves and all of this, but all the time we're thinking. The thing I hear from other writers the most these days is how hard it is for them to concentrate, that they can't focus, that it's taking them longer and longer to write. And I know writers, a lot of friends all over the world, and I hear this again and again from a lot of people, but especially in the UK and in the States. Well, and in France, which is my other major friendship pool.
I do wonder about, so what you said about the glut of apocalypse novels that we were seeing. I wonder, and an audience member had asked this about how COVID has affected your writing, and specifically your publishing lives and launching these books that are coming out. But specific to your writing, has it changed the flavor of what you're writing? Are you going darker? Are you going lighter? are you finding that you need to, in your fictive world, did you have to have more joy or hope than you would have before? Is that something either of you is experiencing?
I don't know about light or dark in that regard, because the novel I'm working on at the minute is probably the darkest thing I've ever written, and I've written some really dark stuff. But I'm finding again the world has been kind of shifting for a few years now, and I don't know again has that influenced the stories getting darker. At the same time, I'm not 100% convinced that's necessarily what people actually want to read. They may want some more levity from their fiction. In terms of specifically COVID-19, the problems for me have been entirely pragmatic, in that I have young kids that aren't at school, and my wife has also been furloughed from work as well, so I don't have the empty house every day that I'm used to for writing, and that, yes, that has slowed things down a lot. Partly because I'm so easy to distract in the first place. It's not as if I'm sort of throwing the kids out of the room when they come and interrupt and kind of go, "Oh, you're interrupting me? Fantastic." So there's that pragmatic sense, but I've been talking to other writers, and we do have the sense that the pandemic itself probably isn't going to show up for the moment. And I had a discussion with my UK editor about the book I'm writing now, whether I should try and reflect on this, and I'd probably even finish the sentence. No. It was very clear not to touch this. But I think it's interesting that I think we can liken this pandemic to a war, in the way that fiction, say after the Second World War, after the Vietnam War, you look at movies that were made during the Second World War, while the war was going on, like Went the Day Well and Mrs. Miniver, which are essentially propaganda pieces. Great stories, but they were essentially keep your chin up, we'll get through this together kind of thing. There were messages that way. It wasn't until years later that people started to look more critically in terms of storytelling. And likewise, Vietnam, I think of movies, it wasn't until the late 70s and 80s that we started getting The Deer Hunter and Full Metal Jacket and so on. And I think COVID-19 is going to be, likewise, the Troubles. I grew up through the Troubles. I was talking about my experience of growing up through the Troubles at the start of this. And it's only really now, over this last decade, after quite a bit of time has passed since the Troubles in Northern Ireland, that people are actually starting to address it in fiction. Milkman being one of the Booker winner from last year, being one of the more famous examples. So I think that COVID-19, this pandemic, isn't something that's going to be explored in fiction this year, next year, but 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, people are going to start looking back on this period. And particularly as writers who emerge, who are maybe in their teens now, or kids, where this is going to be a huge experience for them in their lives. That's going to shape how they see the world from here on, and I think we're going to see that reflected. And I'll also say we're probably going to see it reflected more in abstract ways in science fiction and speculative fiction. It'll show up there first before it shows up in mainstream fiction or literary fiction, I think.
Oh, absolutely. We codify what is going on, and under the pressure of the siege, it's very difficult to not just go with what it is. But I always fall back on the Robert Frost. You can't praise the time in which we act.
I put it far more nicely than I did.
I just want you both to know that there is a cascade of appreciation for your title list, and everyone wants to see it later. I actually need to wind it down, don't I, Stephen? Well, there's been some very excited participation from our audience members. Everyone's saying how charming this discussion has been. So thank both of you gents so much, and thank you for letting me talk to you. I will turn it over to Stephen now, but thank you everyone in the audience for attending.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, James and Stuart, so much. This was an incredibly delightful and charming, as they said, conversation. Thank you for the audience members for coming and listening, hanging out with us. We have another one of these on July 8th with Peter Lovesey and Francine Matthews, which is going to be incredible. So please join us then. You'll see an invite in your inbox, and you'll see more from us from the Getaway newsletter. And I will send you that list for everyone that's been here. I will get some links for you guys for those books. So thanks.
Thanks
Thank
so
you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.